The gentle sound of waves lapping against wooden hulls, the creak of rope and timber, the distant call of seabirds over endless blue waters. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, we'll journey together through one of history's most profound and tragic chapters. A story that shaped continents, destroyed civilizations, and created new ones. A story of human resilience in the face of unimaginable suffering, and of how the echoes of the past continue to shape our world today. This is the complete story of the Atlantic slave trade. A tale that spans 4 centuries, 3 continents, and touches the lives of millions. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, let these words carry you through time, across oceans, to understand how a system of human bondage became the foundation of the modern world. Picture, if you will, the West African coast in the year 1400. The sun sets over kingdoms and empires that have flourished for centuries. Great cities with bustling markets, sophisticated governments, and rich cultural traditions. This is where our story begins, not with slavery, but with thriving civilizations that few in Europe even knew existed. The continent of Africa in the 15th century was home to some of the world's most advanced societies. The Kingdom of Congo, with its capital at Mbanza, Congo, governed a territory larger than modern-day France. Its rulers commanded armies, collected taxes, and maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring states. Further north, the Songhai Empire controlled vast stretches of the Niger River, its merchants trading gold, salt, and ivory across the Sahara to North Africa and beyond. These were not the primitive societies that European colonizers would later claim to have found. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu housed one of the world's largest libraries, with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from mathematics and astronomy to law and literature. African metallurgists had been working iron for over 2,000 years, creating tools and weapons that were often superior to their European counterparts. The social structures of these African societies were complex and varied. Some were monarchies, others were republics, some were centralized states, others were loose confederations of autonomous communities. What they shared was a deep connection to the land, sophisticated systems of governance, and rich spiritual traditions that had been passed down through generations. Trade networks crisscrossed the continent like arteries, carrying goods, ideas, and people from the Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope. Gold from the mines of West Africa had been flowing north across the Sahara for centuries, making its way to the markets of Cairo, Constantinople, and eventually to the treasuries of European kings. African traders were skilled negotiators who understood the value of their goods and drove hard bargains with foreign merchants. It was into this world that Portuguese explorers first sailed in the early 1400s. Prince Henry the Navigator, driven by a desire to find a sea route to the spices of Asia and to spread Christianity, sponsored expeditions that slowly worked their way down the African coast. These early Portuguese voyagers were not conquerors, but traders, seeking to tap into the existing commercial networks that had enriched Africa for generations. The first enslaved Africans to reach Europe through this new maritime route arrived in Lisbon in 1441. They were not the result of massive raids or warfare, but rather the outcome of small-scale kidnapping and opportunistic capture by Portuguese sailors. The numbers were tiny, perhaps a few dozen individuals, but they represented the beginning of something that would grow into a monstrous trade in human beings. Initially, slavery was just one component of Portuguese trade with Africa. They were equally interested in gold, ivory, and exotic goods. The Portuguese established trading posts along the coast, building relationships with African rulers and merchants who controlled access to the interior. These early arrangements were often partnerships, with African kings granting the Portuguese permission to trade in exchange for European goods like textiles, metal tools, and firearms. The crucial moment came with the colonization of the Atlantic islands. The Portuguese had discovered and settled the uninhabited islands of Madeira and the Azores in the early 1400s. These islands, with their tropical climate and fertile soil, proved perfect for growing sugarcane. Sugar was one of the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe, sometimes worth more than its weight in gold. But sugar cultivation was labor-intensive work that required a large workforce willing to toil in difficult conditions. At first, the Portuguese tried using European laborers, including criminals and prisoners of war. But the mortality rate was high, and the supply was limited. They also enslaved the indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands, but their numbers were insufficient for large-scale agriculture. It was then that they turned to Africa, where a steady supply of enslaved people could be obtained through trade with coastal rulers. The island of São Tomé, located off the coast of West Africa, became the testing ground for a new kind of economy based on enslaved African labor. By 1500, São Tomé was producing large quantities of sugar using the labor of thousands of enslaved Africans. The profits were enormous, and the model was about to be exported across the Atlantic to a new world that Europeans had only recently discovered. Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas, beginning in 1492, opened up vast new territories for European colonization. The Spanish quickly established settlements on the Caribbean islands and began exploring the mainland. Like the Portuguese in their Atlantic islands, the Spanish initially tried to use indigenous labor for their colonial projects. But diseases brought by Europeans devastated Native American populations, killing an estimated 90% of the indigenous people within a century of contact. The demographic catastrophe that befell the Americas created a massive labor shortage just as European colonists were establishing plantations to grow crops like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. These were crops that could generate enormous wealth, but only if they could be cultivated on a large scale with intensive labor. The solution, already proven successful in the Portuguese Atlantic islands, was to import enslaved workers from Africa. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas in the early 1500s. Some came directly from Africa, while others had lived for a time in Europe before being transported to the New World. Initially, they worked alongside enslaved indigenous people and European indentured servants. But as the Native American population continued to decline and the demand for labor grew, Africans became the primary source of enslaved workers in the Americas. What made Africans particularly valuable to European colonizers was not any inherent suitability for bondage, but rather a combination of tragic circumstances. First, many Africans had experience with tropical agriculture, making them skilled workers in the climates where Europeans wanted to establish plantations. Second, they had developed immunities to diseases like malaria and yellow fever that often killed Europeans in tropical regions. Third, and most importantly, they were far from home, making escape and rebellion more difficult than it would have been for indigenous people familiar with the local terrain. The transformation of the Atlantic slave trade from a relatively small-scale operation to a massive system of human trafficking happened gradually over the course of the 16th century. As sugar plantations spread throughout the Caribbean and Brazil, and as new crops like tobacco began to be cultivated on the North American mainland, the demand for enslaved workers grew exponentially. European merchants, initially led by the Portuguese and Spanish but soon joined by the Dutch, English, and French, established trading posts and forts along the West African coast. These fortifications served as holding centers where enslaved people could be collected, and prepared for the ocean voyage to the Americas. The most infamous of these was Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana, but similar structures dotted the coastline from Senegal to Angola. The process of enslavement in Africa was complex and varied by region and time period. Some enslaved people were captured in raids organized specifically to supply the Atlantic trade. Others were prisoners of war from conflicts between African states. Still others were enslaved as punishment for crimes or debts according to existing African legal systems. What's crucial to understand is that slavery already existed in Africa before the arrival of Europeans, but the Atlantic trade transformed it in fundamental ways. Traditional African slavery was often quite different from what developed in the Americas. In many African societies, enslaved people could be integrated into families, own property, and even rise to positions of authority. Children of enslaved people were often born free. Slavery was frequently a temporary condition, rather than a permanent status that passed from generation to generation. The Atlantic slave trade changed these dynamics dramatically. The massive demand for enslaved people from the Americas created incentives for African rulers and merchants to enslave more people and to treat them more harshly. Wars between African states increased as rulers sought to capture prisoners who could be sold to European traders. The introduction of firearms by European merchants made these conflicts more deadly and destructive. As the trade expanded, it began to reshape African societies in profound ways. Some states grew wealthy and powerful by participating in the slave trade, using the firearms and other goods they received from Europeans to dominate their neighbors. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in present-day Benin, became notorious for its annual raids to capture people for sale to European traders. Other societies, particularly in the interior, were devastated by constant warfare and slave raids. The human cost of this trade was staggering. Over the course of 4 centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic as slaves, but this number only includes those who survived the journey. Millions more died during the process of enslavement, while being marched to the coast, or during the horrific ocean voyage known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the nightmare at the heart of the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were packed into the cargo holds of ships in conditions that defied human decency. Men, women, and children were chained together in spaces so small they could barely sit up. They were given minimal food and water, and sanitation was virtually non-existent. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and the mortality rate was appalling. Ship captains developed different strategies for maximizing profits from their human cargo. Some followed the tight pack method, cramming as many people as possible into their ships on the theory that even with high mortality rates, they would still deliver more enslaved people to market. Others preferred loose packing, giving enslaved people slightly more space in hopes of keeping more of them alive for the voyage. The psychological trauma of the Middle Passage was as devastating as the physical suffering. Enslaved Africans had been torn from their families, their communities, and everything familiar to them. Many had never seen the ocean before, and they had no idea where they were being taken or what awaited them. Some chose to end their suffering by jumping overboard, despite the chains that bound them. Others organized rebellions, though the odds against success were overwhelming. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced a new horror upon reaching the Americas: the slave markets where they would be sold like livestock. In cities like Charleston, New York, Salvador, and Havana, enslaved people were displayed for inspection by potential buyers. Families were separated, often forever. Children were sold away from their parents. Husbands and wives were purchased by different masters and might never see each other again. The buyers at these markets represented the growing plantation economy that was transforming the Americas. Sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean were the largest consumers of enslaved labor in the early centuries of the trade. These were industrial-scale agricultural operations that produced sugar for export to Europe, where it was refined and sold to an increasingly sweet-toothed population. Working on a sugar plantation was backbreaking labor that literally worked people to death. Enslaved workers toiled from sunrise to sunset cutting cane, feeding it into mills, and tending the fires that boiled the juice into sugar. The mortality rate was so high that plantation owners found it more economical to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to improve conditions enough to sustain their workforce. As European colonies expanded in North America, new crops created new markets for enslaved labor. Tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland, rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, and eventually cotton plantations throughout the American South all relied on the forced labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. The wealth generated by this system of forced labor was enormous. It financed the growth of major European cities, funded the Industrial Revolution, and created some of the greatest fortunes in history. Insurance companies insured enslaved people as valuable property. Banks accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. The profits from slave labor built universities, funded churches, and supported the lavish lifestyles of plantation owners and slave traders. But perhaps most importantly, the Atlantic slave trade created the racial ideologies that would justify centuries of oppression. To make sense of enslaving fellow human beings, Europeans developed elaborate theories about racial hierarchy and African inferiority. These ideas, which had no basis in science or fact, became deeply embedded in Western culture and law. As you drift deeper toward sleep, imagine the courage of those who endured these horrors. Picture the African mother singing lullabies to her child in the darkness of a slave ship, keeping alive the memory of home through song. Think of the young man who learned to read despite laws forbidding it, understanding that knowledge was power. Remember the grandmother who passed down stories of Africa to children born in bondage, ensuring that something of their heritage would survive. This is just the beginning of our journey through the Atlantic slave trade. We've seen how a system of human bondage grew from small beginnings to encompass 3 continents and millions of lives. But there is so much more to understand about this tragic chapter in human history and how its effects continue to shape our world today. The sounds of chains and whips, of crying children and desperate prayers filled the air across the vast plantations of the New World. But even in the darkest moments of bondage, the human spirit found ways to resist, to preserve, and to hope. As you settle deeper into rest, let us continue our journey through this difficult history, understanding how enslaved people fought to maintain their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. By the mid-1600s, the Atlantic slave trade had become a well-oiled machine of human misery. Ships departed European ports loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, rum, and firearms. These vessels sailed to the West African coast, where their cargo was exchanged for enslaved human beings. The ships then crossed the Atlantic to the Americas, where the enslaved people were sold, and the vessels loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other plantation products for the return voyage to Europe. This triangular trade, as historians would later call it, generated profits at every stage. European manufacturers sold their goods to slave traders. African rulers and merchants received valuable European products in exchange for captives. American plantation owners used enslaved labor to produce crops that commanded high prices in European markets. The system seemed perfectly designed to enrich everyone involved, except for the millions of Africans whose lives and labor made it all possible. But the enslaved people were not passive victims. From the moment of capture, they looked for opportunities to resist. On the forced marches to the coast, some escaped into the forest. Others organized uprisings in the coastal holding forts, though these were usually crushed with terrible brutality. Even on the slave ships crossing the Atlantic, rebellions occurred with surprising frequency, despite the overwhelming odds against success. One of the most famous ship rebellions occurred aboard the Amistad in 1839. Led by a man named Cinque, the enslaved Africans killed the ship's captain and most of the crew, then tried to sail back to Africa. When the ship was captured off the coast of Long Island, the case became an international incident that eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. Former President John Quincy Adams argued for the Africans' freedom, and they were eventually allowed to return home. Such dramatic acts of resistance captured public attention, but everyday resistance was far more common. In the Americas, enslaved people developed countless ways to assert their humanity and resist their oppression. They worked slowly when not watched, broke tools, feigned illness, and sometimes poisoned their masters. They created elaborate communication networks that spread news and coordinated activities across plantations and even between colonies. Perhaps most importantly, enslaved people preserved and adapted their African cultures in the New World. Despite efforts by slave owners to strip them of their identities, Africans brought with them rich traditions of music, dance, storytelling, religion, and healing that would survive and evolve in their new environment. In the American South, enslaved people blended African musical traditions with European and Native American influences to create new forms of expression. Work songs helped coordinate labor and pass the time during long days in the fields. Spirituals drew on Christian imagery, while often containing coded messages about escape routes and resistance activities. The ring shout, a form of religious dance that moved in a counterclockwise circle, preserved African spiritual practices within a Christian framework. African religious traditions proved remarkably resilient. In Haiti, Vodou emerged as a synthesis of West African religions with Catholicism. In Brazil, Candomblé and Umbanda similarly blended African deities with Catholic saints. In Cuba, Santeria created another unique fusion of African and European spiritual traditions. These religions provided not just spiritual comfort, but also community networks and sometimes organizational structures for resistance. The preservation of African healing traditions was particularly important in societies where enslaved people received minimal medical care. African healers, often women, maintained knowledge of herbal medicines and healing practices that proved essential for community survival. Many of these traditions would eventually influence broader American folk medicine and even modern pharmaceutical research. Family structures, though constantly threatened by the slave system, remained central to African American life. Despite laws that did not recognize slave marriages and the constant threat of family separation through sale, enslaved people created kinship networks that extended beyond blood relations. Children might be raised by multiple adults in the slave quarters, ensuring that they learned not just survival skills, but also cultural traditions and values. The development of distinct African American communities was most visible in places where large numbers of enslaved people lived and worked together. The Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia became home to the Gula people, who preserved more African cultural elements than almost any other group in North America. Their language, a Creole that blended English with various African languages, their crafts, particularly basket weaving, and their cultural practices maintained strong connections to West African traditions. In the cities of the Americas, different dynamics emerged. Urban slavery often allowed for more mobility and contact between enslaved and free people. Enslaved artisans might hire out their time, keeping a portion of their earnings while giving the rest to their masters. Some managed to purchase their freedom or that of family members through these arrangements. Cities also became centers of free black communities that grew through manumission, self-purchase, and escape. These communities provided support networks for both free and enslaved African Americans. Churches became particularly important institutions, offering not just spiritual guidance but also education, mutual aid, and sometimes coordination for resistance activities. The presence of free black communities complicated the racial ideologies that justified slavery. How could whites maintain that Africans were naturally suited for bondage when free blacks demonstrated intelligence, skill, and achievement equal to any white person? The response was often to impose increasingly harsh restrictions on free blacks, limiting their movements, their right to own property, and their access to education. Despite these restrictions, some free blacks achieved remarkable success. In New Orleans, a community of free people of color became prominent in business, real estate, and the arts. Some even owned slaves themselves, though this was often a strategy to protect family members who were legally enslaved. In Charleston, free blacks dominated certain trades like carpentry and tailoring. In the North, where slavery was gradually abolished after the American Revolution, free black communities established schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. The experiences of women in slavery deserve particular attention, as they faced unique forms of exploitation and resistance. Enslaved women performed the same backbreaking field labor as men while also bearing and raising children under horrific conditions. They were subject to sexual assault by white men, with no legal recourse or protection. Yet they also played crucial roles in preserving African American culture and community. Women were often the keepers of traditional knowledge about healing, cooking, and childcare. They sang the lullabies that preserved African languages and stories. They taught children survival skills and cultural values. Many of the most effective forms of resistance relied on networks of women who shared information and supported each other through the daily struggles of enslaved life. Some women found ways to use their positions in slave owners' households to gather intelligence and aid resistance efforts. House servants often overheard conversations about slave sales, political developments, or military movements that could be crucial information for enslaved communities. Women who worked as cooks or laundresses might have opportunities to slip food or supplies to runaways. The domestic slave trade within the Americas added another layer of trauma to the slave experience. As the original 13 colonies expanded westward and new territories were opened for plantation agriculture, enslaved people were bought and sold in massive internal migrations. The development of cotton cultivation in the Deep South, made profitable by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, created enormous demand for enslaved labor. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were marched or shipped from the older slave states of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas to the new cotton lands of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These forced migrations broke up families and communities that had been established for generations. The domestic slave trade became a major business in itself, with professional slave traders organizing coffles of chained people for the journey west. The expansion of slavery westward created ongoing political tensions in the United States. Each new territory that applied for statehood raised the question of whether slavery would be allowed. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 all attempted to manage these tensions, but they ultimately proved irreconcilable. Meanwhile, opposition to slavery was growing both in the Americas and in Europe. The Enlightenment ideals of human equality and natural rights, which had inspired the American and French revolutions, were increasingly difficult to reconcile with the continued enslavement of millions of people. Religious movements, particularly among Quakers and evangelical Christians, began to view slavery as incompatible with Christian teachings. The first successful slave rebellion that established an independent nation occurred in Haiti between 1791 and 1804. Led initially by Toussaint Louverture and later by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue defeated not only their masters, but also armies sent by France, Britain, and Spain. The establishment of Haiti as an independent black republic sent shockwaves throughout the slaveholding world. The Haitian Revolution proved that enslaved people could successfully overthrow their oppressors, inspiring resistance movements throughout the Americas while terrifying slave owners. Laws restricting the movements and activities of both enslaved and free blacks were tightened throughout the slave societies. The example of Haiti would continue to influence abolitionist thought and slave resistance for decades to come. In the United States, several major slave rebellions occurred in the early 1800s. Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in Charleston in 1822, and Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831 all reflected the growing tensions within slave society. Though these rebellions were suppressed, often with extreme violence, they demonstrated the fundamental instability of a system based on the forced subjugation of human beings. The growth of the abolitionist movement in the North added another source of pressure on the slave system. Activists like William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the newspaper The Liberator, demanded the immediate end of slavery rather than gradual emancipation. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became one of the most powerful orators of his time, brought first-hand testimony about the horrors of slavery to Northern audiences. The Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and secret routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, became a symbol of both black resistance and white support for abolition. Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, making repeated trips into the South to lead others to freedom. Her courage and success earned her the nickname Moses among the enslaved people she helped liberate. As the 1800s progressed, the economic importance of slavery in the global economy began to shift. The British Empire abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833, followed by France in 1848. These decisions were influenced by both moral arguments and economic calculations, as the Industrial Revolution made slave labor less central to economic growth than it had been in previous centuries. However, in the United States, slavery became more entrenched rather than less so. The invention of the cotton gin had made cotton cultivation extremely profitable, and the crop became America's most valuable export. By 1860, the 4 million enslaved people in the United States were worth more than all the country's manufacturing and railroads combined. The political tensions over slavery finally erupted into civil war in 1861. Though the war began primarily as a conflict over secession rather than slavery, it quickly became clear that the future of human bondage was at stake. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared enslaved people in rebelling states to be free, though it would take Union military victory to make this promise a reality. As you drift toward deeper sleep, reflect on the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Think of the mother who taught her children to read by candlelight, knowing that knowledge could set them free. Remember the father who worked extra hours to earn money to purchase his family's freedom. Consider the community that gathered in secret to worship, sing, and plan for a better future. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is not just one of suffering and oppression, but also of resistance, survival, and the preservation of human dignity under the most difficult circumstances. The cultural traditions, the family bonds, the faith and hope that enslaved people maintained would become the foundation for the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality that continues to this day. Our journey through this history continues, as we explore how the formal end of slavery did not end the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade, and how its effects continue to shape our world centuries after the last slave ship crossed the ocean. The sound of church bells echoing across plantation fields on Sunday mornings. The whispered conversations in slave quarters as families planned for uncertain futures. The steady rhythm of hammers and saws as free black communities built their own institutions from nothing. As you sink deeper into rest, we continue following the threads of this vast human story as it weaves through the final decades of legal bondage and into the complicated aftermath of emancipation. The American Civil War that erupted in 1861 transformed the landscape of slavery forever, though not in ways that anyone could have predicted. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, most Americans believed the conflict would be brief. Few imagined that it would become the bloodiest war in American history, claiming over 600,000 lives and fundamentally reshaping the nation's relationship with human bondage. For enslaved people throughout the South, the war created unprecedented opportunities and dangers. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, thousands of enslaved people fled plantations to seek refuge behind federal lines. These self-liberated individuals, whom Union commanders called contrabands, created the first cracks in the institution of slavery long before any official proclamation of freedom. The sight of enslaved people voting with their feet, abandoning plantations en masse to join advancing Union forces, forced Northern leaders to confront the reality that this war could not be won without addressing slavery directly. General Benjamin Butler's decision to refuse to return escaped slaves to their masters, declaring them contraband of war, established a precedent that spread throughout Union-occupied territories. These contraband camps became laboratories for freedom, places where formerly enslaved people began the difficult transition from bondage to liberty. Men, women, and children who had never been allowed to make decisions about their own lives suddenly faced choices about where to live, how to support themselves, and how to protect their families. Missionary societies from the North sent teachers to establish schools, and for the first time, large numbers of formerly enslaved people had the opportunity to learn to read and write. The challenges were immense. Disease swept through overcrowded camps where sanitation was poor and medical care limited. Families that had been separated by slavery struggled to reunite across vast distances with no reliable communication systems. Former slaves had to navigate a complex economy where their labor was valuable, but their rights remained uncertain. Yet remarkable stories of adaptation and achievement emerged from these camps. Former slaves became teachers, preachers, and community leaders. They formed mutual aid societies and organized schools. They proved, to any who cared to observe, that the racist assumptions underlying slavery were false. Given opportunity and education, formerly enslaved people demonstrated intelligence, ambition, and capability equal to anyone. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 fundamentally changed the character of the Civil War. What had begun as a conflict over preserving the Union became explicitly a war to end slavery. The proclamation declared enslaved people in rebelling states to be free, though it notably exempted loyal border states and Union-occupied areas where slavery remained legal. The proclamation's limitations revealed the complex politics surrounding emancipation. Lincoln needed to maintain the loyalty of border states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, where slavery remained legal but the states had not joined the Confederacy. He also had to consider Northern public opinion, which was divided on the question of racial equality, even among those who opposed slavery. Despite its limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the conflict into a moral crusade that made foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy virtually impossible. Britain and France, both of which had abolished slavery in their own territories, could not support a slaveholding Confederacy fighting against a Union committed to emancipation. The proclamation also opened the door for African American military service in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black men, most of them formerly enslaved, would serve in Union forces during the war. Their military service provided powerful evidence of African American patriotism and capability, while also giving black communities a stake in Union victory that extended beyond simple freedom from bondage. Black Union soldiers faced discrimination within the Army, receiving lower pay than white soldiers and often being assigned to manual labor rather than combat roles. When they did fight, they faced particular brutality from Confederate forces, who often executed captured black soldiers rather than treating them as prisoners of war. The massacre at Fort Pillow in 1864, where Confederate forces killed black Union soldiers who had surrendered, exemplified the racial hatred that made this Civil War particularly vicious. Yet black soldiers distinguished themselves in battle after battle. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry's assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina became legendary for its courage under fire. The Louisiana Native Guards, composed of free men of color from New Orleans, proved their mettle in numerous engagements. These military contributions would later become important arguments for political equality in the post-war period. Meanwhile, the war was devastating the Southern economy and society that slavery had built. The Confederate military's need for soldiers pulled white men away from plantations, leaving women, children, and elderly men to manage enslaved workforces. As Union armies occupied more territory and enslaved people escaped in growing numbers, agricultural production collapsed across much of the South. The Confederate government's attempts to mobilize enslaved labor for military purposes further undermined the institution. Slaves were impressed to build fortifications, work in factories, and serve as teamsters and laborers for the army. This military service gave enslaved people new knowledge of the broader world and opportunities to escape that many seized. Southern white women, left to manage plantations with dwindling enslaved workforces, often discovered that their authority was far more fragile than they had imagined. Without white men to enforce discipline through violence, many enslaved people simply stopped obeying orders. They worked when they chose to, took food and supplies as they needed them, and in many cases simply walked away from plantations. The gradual collapse of slavery during the war years created a complex situation where freedom existed in practice long before it was legally recognized. In many areas, enslaved people continued to work on plantations, but negotiated their own terms, demanding payment for their labor and better treatment. These wartime arrangements prefigured the sharecropping and tenant farming systems that would emerge after the war. As Union victory became increasingly certain, debates intensified over what freedom would mean for formerly enslaved people. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for land redistribution, arguing that political freedom without economic independence would be meaningless. They pointed to the success of land redistribution experiments during the war, such as General Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which allocated abandoned plantation lands to formerly enslaved families along the South Carolina and Georgia coast. More conservative Republicans, including President Lincoln, favored a more gradual approach that would protect property rights while ensuring basic civil liberties for freed people. Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 brought Andrew Johnson to the presidency, and his lenient policies toward the defeated Confederacy would shape the difficult years of Reconstruction that followed. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 formally abolished slavery throughout the United States, completing a process that had begun with individual acts of escape and resistance during the war. But constitutional freedom did not immediately translate into practical equality or economic opportunity. The period of Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, represented both the greatest opportunity and the greatest tragedy in the aftermath of American slavery. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the promises of freedom might be fulfilled. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and the 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights. During Reconstruction, African Americans participated in Southern politics to an extent that would not be seen again for nearly a century. Black men served in state legislatures, in Congress, and in local offices throughout the South. They helped write new state constitutions that established public school systems and expanded democratic participation. The sight of formerly enslaved people holding political office and exercising the rights of citizenship represented a revolutionary transformation of Southern society. Yet this political revolution faced violent resistance from the beginning. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations used intimidation, violence, and murder to prevent African Americans from exercising their political rights. White Southerners who had lost the war on the battlefield continued fighting through terrorism and economic coercion. The federal government's commitment to protecting the rights of formerly enslaved people proved limited and temporary. As Northern interest in Reconstruction waned and economic concerns took precedence, federal troops were gradually withdrawn from the South. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, effectively ended federal protection for African American rights in exchange for Southern acceptance of Republican Rutherford Hayes as president. The end of Reconstruction opened the door to the systematic dismantling of African American rights through legal and extra-legal means. Southern states passed black codes and later Jim Crow laws that severely restricted the freedom of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. These laws mandated racial segregation in public facilities, limited African American access to education and employment, and used poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent black voting. The sharecropping system that emerged in the post-war South trapped many formerly enslaved people in cycles of debt and poverty that resembled slavery in many ways. Landowners provided tools, seeds, and supplies to tenant farmers in exchange for a share of the crop, typically half or more. Since landowners also controlled the stores where sharecroppers purchased necessities and the scales where crops were weighed, the system was designed to keep farmers perpetually in debt. This economic bondage was enforced through violence and legal manipulation. Vagrancy laws allowed authorities to arrest unemployed black men and lease them to private employers as convict laborers. Debt peonage laws made it illegal to leave an employer while owing money, trapping workers in exploitative relationships. The convict lease system essentially re-enslaved thousands of African American men who were worked under conditions often worse than slavery, since their employers had no long-term investment in keeping them alive. Despite these obstacles, formerly enslaved people and their descendants continued building communities and institutions that would sustain them through the long struggle for equality. Black churches became centers not only of spiritual life, but also of education, political organization, and mutual aid. Schools established during Reconstruction, often with help from Northern missionary societies, laid the foundation for African American educational achievement, despite severe underfunding and legal restrictions. The period also saw the emergence of African American intellectual and political leaders who would shape the ongoing freedom struggle. Booker T. Washington advocated for economic advancement through industrial education and accommodation to white supremacy. W.E.B. Du Bois argued for immediate political equality and higher education for the talented tenth of African Americans who could provide leadership for the race. These different approaches reflected the difficult choices facing a people caught between the promise of freedom and the reality of continued oppression. Meanwhile, the global context of slavery was also changing. Brazil, which had imported more enslaved Africans than any other country, finally abolished slavery in 1888, making it the last nation in the Americas to end legal bondage. This abolition came gradually, with laws freeing children born to enslaved mothers and elderly slaves, before final emancipation ended centuries of African bondage in the Americas. The end of legal slavery did not end the suffering of its victims, or resolve the contradictions it had created in American society. The wealth built through slave labor remained concentrated in white hands, while formerly enslaved people and their descendants faced systematic exclusion from economic opportunities. The racial ideologies developed to justify slavery persisted long after emancipation, shaping laws, customs, and attitudes that would limit African American freedom for generations. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet determination of a formerly enslaved woman teaching herself to read by lamplight, knowing that education was the key to her children's future. Picture the courage of a black veteran of the Civil War casting his first vote, despite threats from hooded terrorists. Think of the faith that sustained communities building churches and schools with their own hands, creating institutions that would nurture future generations. The formal end of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery itself marked not an ending, but a transformation. The system of racial oppression that had justified human bondage evolved into new forms of discrimination and exclusion. Yet the resistance, resilience, and community building that had sustained enslaved people through centuries of bondage would continue to inspire the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality. Our journey through this history continues as we explore how the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade shaped the modern world, influencing everything from global economic patterns to contemporary struggles for racial justice. The echoes of those slave ships still reverberate through our societies today, reminding us that understanding this history is essential for comprehending the world we have inherited. The whispered conversations in tenant farming shacks across the American South, the sound of feet shuffling through dusty roads as families searched for work and dignity, the distant echo of ship horns in harbors that had once received human cargo, now carrying different kinds of freight. As your breathing deepens and your mind settles, we continue tracing the invisible threads that connect the Atlantic slave trade to the world that emerged from its ashes. By the dawn of the 20th century, the formal structures of slavery had crumbled across the Americas, but the economic and social patterns it had created proved remarkably persistent. The plantation agriculture that had driven the demand for enslaved labor transformed into new systems of racial control and economic exploitation that would define the American South for generations to come. The Great Migration, that began around 1910, represented one of the largest internal population movements in American history. Over 6 million African Americans left the rural South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West, seeking economic opportunities and escape from the suffocating restrictions of Jim Crow segregation. This movement echoed the forced migrations of the slave trade era, but now people moved by choice, carrying with them the cultural traditions and survival strategies that had sustained their communities through centuries of bondage. Northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York experienced dramatic demographic changes as Southern black families arrived by train, often carrying their possessions in cardboard suitcases tied with rope. They found work in steel mills, automobile factories, meatpacking plants, and domestic service. While these jobs offered better wages than sharecropping, African Americans still faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education that confined them to segregated neighborhoods and limited their opportunities for advancement. The cultural flowering known as the Harlem Renaissance emerged from this urban migration, as African American artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals created new forms of expression that drew on both African heritage and American experience. Jazz music, born in the streets of New Orleans and carried north by migrating musicians, became a uniquely American art form that transformed global popular culture. The blues, work songs, and spirituals that had sustained enslaved communities evolved into new musical forms that spoke to the experiences of urban black life. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay explored themes of identity, belonging, and resistance that reflected the complex legacy of slavery in African American life. Their work celebrated black culture while confronting the ongoing reality of racial oppression. The concept of the double consciousness, articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois, captured the psychological burden of being both American and African, fully belonging to neither identity while being shaped by both. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the European nations that had grown wealthy through the slave trade were reshaping Africa through colonial conquest. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw European powers carve up the continent among themselves, establishing colonial systems that exploited African labor and resources in ways that paralleled earlier forms of bondage. Colonial labor systems in Africa often amounted to slavery by another name. The Belgian Congo's rubber plantations worked Africans to death under conditions that shocked even contemporary observers. French and British colonies used forced labor for road building, mining, and agricultural projects. The apartheid system in South Africa institutionalized racial segregation and labor exploitation that drew directly on the ideological framework developed to justify the Atlantic slave trade. These colonial systems disrupted traditional African societies, just as the slave trade had done centuries earlier. Young men were forced to work in mines and plantations far from their communities. Traditional political structures were dismantled or co-opted to serve colonial administrators. African cultures and languages were suppressed in favor of European customs and education systems designed to produce compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. The two world wars of the 20th century created new opportunities and challenges for people of African descent around the globe. African American soldiers who fought for democracy abroad returned home to face continued segregation and discrimination, creating tensions that would fuel the civil rights movement. African colonial subjects who had fought for European powers began demanding independence and self-determination. The emergence of Pan-African movements connected struggles for freedom across the Atlantic world. Leaders like Marcus Garvey promoted the idea that people of African descent worldwide shared common interests and should work together for liberation from white supremacy. His Universal Negro Improvement Association attracted millions of followers who found hope in his message of black pride and self-determination. The independence movements that swept across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s represented the final dismantling of the colonial systems that had succeeded the slave trade. Ghana, led by Kwame Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence in 1957. Across the continent, new nations emerged as Africans reclaimed control over their own destinies after centuries of foreign domination. Yet independence did not automatically undo the damage caused by centuries of exploitation. The borders drawn by colonial powers often grouped together ethnic groups that had been enemies or separated peoples who shared common cultures. The economies that emerged from colonialism remained dependent on exporting raw materials to former colonial powers, perpetuating patterns of economic subordination that had roots in the slave trade era. In the United States, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s finally challenged the legal structures of racial segregation that had replaced slavery. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks's refusal to give up her bus seat, demonstrated the power of organized resistance rooted in the Black church traditions that had sustained enslaved communities. The movement's emphasis on nonviolent resistance drew inspiration from both Christian teachings and the philosophical traditions of Mahatma Gandhi. The success of the civil rights movement in dismantling legal segregation represented a triumph of the human spirit over centuries of oppression. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally fulfilled some of the promises made during Reconstruction a century earlier. African Americans could now vote freely, attend integrated schools, and access public accommodations without legal restrictions based on race. Yet the end of legal segregation did not eliminate the economic and social inequalities that had been created by centuries of exploitation. The wealth gap between Black and white families remained enormous, reflecting generations of exclusion from home ownership, business ownership, and educational opportunities. Residential segregation persisted in many areas, maintained by discriminatory lending practices, real estate steering, and informal social pressures. The urban uprisings of the 1960s revealed the frustration of African Americans who found that legal equality had not translated into economic opportunity or social justice. The riots in Watts, Detroit, Newark, and other cities reflected anger over police brutality, unemployment, inadequate housing, and limited educational opportunities that trapped many Black families in poverty despite the gains of the civil rights movement. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 marked the end of an era of hope and optimism about racial progress. The Black Power movement that emerged in the late 1960s took a more militant approach to achieving equality, emphasizing Black pride, cultural nationalism, and sometimes armed self-defense. Leaders like Malcolm X and organizations like the Black Panther Party challenged both white supremacy and the accommodating approach of traditional civil rights organizations. The 1970s and 1980s saw both continued progress and new challenges for African Americans. Affirmative action programs opened doors to higher education and professional careers that had been closed to previous generations. A Black middle class emerged that achieved levels of education, income, and social status that would have been unimaginable under slavery or segregation. African Americans were elected to political offices at all levels of government, including mayoralties of major cities and seats in Congress. Yet economic changes in these decades also created new forms of disadvantage. The decline of manufacturing industries that had provided good jobs for working-class Blacks during the Great Migration left many urban communities devastated. The rise of crack cocaine in the 1980s, combined with harsh sentencing laws that disproportionately affected African Americans, led to mass incarceration that removed hundreds of thousands of Black men from their communities and families. The election of Barack Obama as the first African American president in 2008 seemed to represent the ultimate triumph over the legacy of slavery and segregation. His election demonstrated that racial barriers that had once seemed insurmountable could be overcome through individual achievement and changing social attitudes. The sight of a Black family in the White House provided powerful symbolism about how far America had traveled from its origins as a slaveholding republic. Yet Obama's presidency also revealed the persistence of racial tensions that many Americans had hoped were resolved. The birther conspiracy theories that questioned his citizenship, the rise of the Tea Party movement with its sometimes explicitly racial appeals, and the emergence of new forms of voter suppression targeting African American communities all demonstrated that the election of a black president had not ended racial conflict in America. The Black Lives Matter movement that emerged in the 2010s brought new attention to issues of police violence and criminal justice reform that disproportionately affected African American communities. The movement's emphasis on systemic racism rather than individual prejudice reflected a more sophisticated understanding of how historical patterns of discrimination continued to shape contemporary inequalities. The global context of racial justice also evolved in new directions during this period. The end of apartheid in South Africa in 1994 eliminated the last major system of legal racial segregation anywhere in the world. Yet new forms of racial and ethnic conflict emerged in various regions, often rooted in colonial legacies and economic inequalities that traced back to earlier systems of exploitation. Immigration patterns in the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new African and Caribbean populations to the United States and Europe, creating more diverse Black communities with different experiences and perspectives on race and identity. Recent African immigrants often had educational and economic advantages that distinguished their experiences from those of African Americans, whose families had endured centuries of slavery and segregation. The study of the Atlantic slave trade itself evolved significantly during this period. Historians gained access to new sources and developed more sophisticated methods for analyzing the scope and impact of the trade. Digital databases allowed scholars to track individual slave voyages and trace the movements of enslaved people with unprecedented precision. Archaeological investigations of slave quarters, ship remains, and African sites provided new insights into the daily experiences of enslaved people. These scholarly advances revealed the full magnitude of the slave trade's impact on both sides of the Atlantic. Estimates of the number of Africans transported to the Americas were revised upward as new sources came to light. The demographic impact on Africa was recognized as even more severe than previously understood, with some regions losing significant portions of their young adult populations to the trade. The economic analysis of slavery also became more sophisticated, with historians calculating the enormous wealth that slave labor had generated for individuals, companies, and entire nations. Studies revealed how profits from slave labor had financed the Industrial Revolution, built major universities, and funded the growth of financial institutions that remained prominent into the modern era. As you settle into deeper rest, consider how the threads of this history continue to weave through our contemporary world. The global patterns of wealth and poverty that we see today still reflect the economic relationships established during the era of the slave trade. The racial ideologies that were created to justify human bondage continue to influence social attitudes and institutional practices. The cultural traditions that sustained enslaved communities have evolved into vibrant forms of expression that enrich societies around the world. The resistance strategies that enslaved people developed to survive and maintain their humanity under impossible conditions continue to inspire social justice movements today. The networks of mutual support that sustained Black communities through slavery and segregation remain essential to addressing contemporary challenges. The faith traditions that provided hope during the darkest periods of bondage continue to sustain communities, fighting for equality and justice. Understanding the Atlantic slave trade and its legacy is not simply an academic exercise in studying the past. It is essential preparation for addressing the ongoing challenges of creating more just and equitable societies. The patterns of exploitation and resistance that defined the slave trade era continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The sounds of protests echoing through city streets, the voices of students learning African American history in integrated classrooms, the rhythm of contemporary music that carries echoes of work songs and spirituals. Our journey through this history continues to reveal how the past lives on in the present, and how understanding where we came from helps us navigate where we are going. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is far from over. Its consequences continue to unfold in our politics, our economies, our cultures, and our personal relationships. As we continue exploring this vast historical landscape, we gain not only knowledge of the past, but also tools for building a more just future. The gentle hum of machinery in textile mills, where former slaves found work, the rustling of legal documents as lawyers crafted new forms of racial control, the quiet conversations in boardrooms where corporate leaders discussed the changing labor landscape. As sleep deepens around you, we continue following the invisible currents that carried the legacy of the slave trade into the modern industrial age. The transformation of American capitalism in the late 19th century could not escape the shadow of its slaveholding past. The same financial institutions that had ensured enslaved people as property now underwrote the expansion of railroads, steel production, and manufacturing. Investment banks that had profited from slave-produced cotton turned their attention to financing industrial development, carrying forward the accumulated capital that centuries of unpaid labor had generated. Railroad construction across the American South relied heavily on convict labor, a system that disproportionately imprisoned African American men on minor charges and then leased them to private companies. These convict workers built the infrastructure that would modernize the region, their unpaid labor continuing patterns of exploitation that stretched back to the plantation era. The death rates among convict workers often exceeded those of enslaved people, since companies had no long-term investment in keeping them alive. The steel mills of Birmingham, Alabama, became notorious for their use of convict labor in the coal mines and blast furnaces. Companies could lease prisoners for a fraction of what they would pay free workers, while the state profited from fees paid by employers. This system created incentives for harsh sentencing and arbitrary arrests that trapped thousands of African Americans in a new form of bondage that lasted well into the 20th century. Northern industrialists, despite their region's role in ending slavery, proved equally willing to exploit the economic advantages created by racial oppression. Textile mills in New England continued processing cotton grown by sharecroppers working under conditions that resembled slavery. Insurance companies expanded their operations using capital accumulated from insuring enslaved people and slave ships. Banks that had financed the slave trade diversified into industrial lending while maintaining discriminatory practices that excluded African Americans from business loans and mortgages. The emergence of consumer capitalism in the early 20th century created new markets for products that had once been luxuries available only to the wealthy. Sugar, which had driven much of the Atlantic slave trade, became a mass-market commodity as candy manufacturers, soft drink companies, and processed food producers expanded their reach. The sweet taste that had once justified the suffering of millions became democratized, though few consumers understood the historical connections between their daily pleasures and past tragedies. Corporate advertising began shaping American culture in ways that both perpetuated and challenged racial stereotypes rooted in the slave era. Brands like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben used imagery that romanticized slavery while marketing products to white consumers who found comfort in nostalgic portrayals of happy enslaved people. These marketing campaigns helped maintain the fiction that slavery had been a benevolent institution, obscuring the reality of systematic brutality and resistance. Yet the same period saw the emergence of African American entrepreneurs who challenged these stereotypes through their business success. Madam C.J. Walker built a cosmetics empire that made her one of the wealthiest women in America. Robert Abbott founded the Chicago Defender, a newspaper that became instrumental in promoting the Great Migration. These success stories demonstrated the potential that had been suppressed by centuries of bondage and discrimination. The financial innovations of the early 20th century created new opportunities for both exploitation and advancement. Credit systems that had once been used to trap sharecroppers in debt cycles evolved into more sophisticated forms of lending that could either expand opportunities or create new forms of economic bondage. Life insurance companies that had insured enslaved people as property began marketing policies to African American families, though often at discriminatory rates that reflected racial prejudices about mortality and risk. Urban housing markets developed patterns of racial segregation that were enforced through legal restrictions, informal agreements among real estate agents, and sometimes violence. The wealth-building potential of home ownership, which had been denied to enslaved people and their descendants, remained largely inaccessible to African American families well into the mid-20th century. This exclusion from property ownership perpetuated wealth gaps that had originated during the slave era. The labor movement that emerged in response to industrial capitalism faced complex challenges around racial solidarity. Many white workers saw African Americans as threats to their wages and working conditions, particularly when employers used black workers as strikebreakers during labor disputes. This racial division weakened the labor movement while perpetuating economic inequalities rooted in the slave system. Some labor organizations attempted to build interracial solidarity, recognizing that racial divisions served the interests of employers who wanted to keep workers from uniting. The industrial workers of the world and some Congress of Industrial Organizations unions actively recruited African American members and fought against workplace discrimination. These efforts achieved limited success, but demonstrated the potential for cross-racial organizing around shared economic interests. The technological innovations of the industrial age transformed agricultural production in ways that affected the descendants of enslaved people. Mechanical cotton pickers reduced the demand for agricultural labor just as millions of African Americans were seeking alternatives to sharecropping. This technological displacement contributed to the Great Migration, as rural families sought opportunities in industrial cities. The development of chemical fertilizers and pesticides changed farming practices throughout the former slave regions. Large agricultural corporations began consolidating land ownership, displacing small farmers of all races, but particularly affecting African American families who had limited access to capital for modernizing their operations. The concentration of agricultural ownership continued patterns of land dispossession that stretched back to the end of Reconstruction. International economic relationships also reflected the continuing influence of slave trade patterns. European colonial powers in Africa extracted raw materials using forced labor systems that resembled slavery in all but name. American companies invested in these colonial enterprises, extending economic relationships based on racial exploitation across national boundaries. The emergence of multinational corporations in the mid-20th century created new forms of economic interdependence that often replicated historical patterns of exploitation. Companies based in former slave-trading nations established operations in Africa and Latin America that extracted resources and exploited cheap labor. These relationships perpetuated global inequalities that had originated during the Atlantic slave trade era. Educational institutions that had been built with slave-generated wealth began acknowledging their historical connections to bondage, though often without addressing the contemporary implications of their past. Universities in both the North and South discovered that their endowments had been funded by profits from slave labor. their buildings constructed by enslaved workers, and their early students drawn from slaveholding families. The medical profession grappled with its own troubling history of experimenting on enslaved people and perpetuating racial theories that justified discrimination. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, reflected the continuation of medical racism that treated African American bodies as subjects for research rather than patients deserving care and respect. Legal institutions struggled to address the continuing effects of laws and court decisions that had been shaped by slavery and segregation. Property law, contract law, and criminal law all carried forward precedents that had been established to protect slave owners' interests or control enslaved people's behavior. Reforming these legal frameworks required confronting how fundamental aspects of American law had been distorted by the need to maintain racial hierarchy. The development of social welfare systems in the 20th century often excluded African Americans through design features that reflected racial prejudices. Social Security initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, occupations where African Americans were concentrated. The GI Bill provided educational and housing benefits that helped create the white middle class, while discriminatory implementation limited African American access to these opportunities. Urban planning and development policies created new forms of racial segregation that concentrated poverty in areas with limited access to quality schools, healthcare, and employment opportunities. Highway construction often divided African American neighborhoods, while urban renewal projects displaced Black communities in the name of progress. These policies created lasting patterns of racial inequality in American cities. The entertainment industry both challenged and reinforced racial stereotypes inherited from the slave era. Hollywood films often portrayed African Americans through caricatures that echoed minstrel show traditions, while radio and television programming reinforced ideas about racial difference. Yet African American performers also used these media to challenge stereotypes and assert their humanity and creativity. The emergence of television as a dominant cultural force in the 1950s created new opportunities for both perpetuating and challenging racial prejudices. Programs like Amos and Andy reinforced negative stereotypes, while shows featuring African American performers like Nat King Cole faced boycotts from sponsors unwilling to risk alienating white audiences. Sports provided one arena where African American excellence could not be denied, though integration proceeded slowly and against significant resistance. Jackie Robinson's breaking of baseball's color barrier in 1947 demonstrated both the potential for change and the intensity of opposition to racial equality. The success of African American athletes in professional sports gradually challenged assumptions about racial inferiority while creating new forms of role models for young people. The Cold War context of the 1950s and 1960s created international pressure for the United States to address racial discrimination that contradicted its claims to represent freedom and democracy. Soviet propaganda effectively highlighted American racial hypocrisy, forcing U.S. leaders to consider how domestic racism undermined the nation's international credibility. International travel and communication began exposing more Americans to different perspectives on race and identity. African American soldiers stationed overseas during World War II and subsequent conflicts encountered societies with different racial attitudes, while foreign visitors to the United States observed and sometimes criticized American racial practices. The decolonization movements in Africa and Asia provided inspiration for American civil rights activists while also challenging assumptions about Western superiority that had justified both slavery and colonialism. The success of independence movements led by people of color demonstrated the possibility of overcoming systems of racial domination. As you drift deeper into sleep, Imagine the quiet determination of a young woman walking to work in a textile mill, her grandmother's songs echoing in her memory. Picture the concentration of a student bent over law books in a segregated library, preparing to challenge unjust statutes in court. Think of the hope in a father's eyes as he signed papers to buy his family's first home in a neighborhood that had previously excluded people who looked like him. The threads of this vast historical tapestry continue weaving through our contemporary world. The economic patterns established during the slave trade era evolved, but never disappeared entirely. The ideologies created to justify human bondage transformed into new forms of racial thinking that influenced law, culture, and social relationships. The resistance strategies developed by enslaved people provided blueprints for later movements seeking justice and equality. Understanding these connections helps illuminate how historical injustices continue shaping contemporary inequalities. The wealth gaps, educational disparities, and health differences that characterize modern America did not emerge spontaneously, but developed over centuries of systematic exclusion and exploitation. Recognizing these patterns is essential for addressing their ongoing effects. The cultural contributions of enslaved people and their descendants enriched American society in ways that extended far beyond their recognition or compensation. Musical forms, artistic traditions, culinary practices, and storytelling techniques that originated in slave communities became central elements of American culture, though their origins were often obscured or appropriated without acknowledgement. Religious traditions that sustained enslaved communities through their darkest hours continued providing spiritual resources for addressing contemporary challenges. The Black Church remained a crucial institution for organizing social action, preserving cultural memory, and nurturing leadership for ongoing struggles for justice. Our journey through this history reveals how the past lives on in the present, shaping everything from global economic relationships to personal family stories. The Atlantic slave trade was not simply a historical event that ended with abolition, but a foundational experience that created lasting patterns of inequality and resistance that continue evolving today. The story continues unfolding as new generations grapple with this legacy, seeking ways to acknowledge historical injustices while building more equitable futures. The voices of those who endured slavery and those who continue fighting for freedom blend together across the centuries, reminding us that the work of justice is never finished. As sleep deepens around you, rest in the knowledge that understanding this history provides tools for creating positive change. The courage, creativity, and resilience that sustained people through centuries of bondage remain available to inspire contemporary efforts to build more just and compassionate societies. The long arc of this story bends toward justice, but only through the continued efforts of those who refuse to accept inequality as permanent. The soft murmur of voices in packed churches on Sunday mornings, the scrape of pencils on slate as children learn to write their names in freedom schools, the rhythmic clatter of printing presses producing newspapers that carried stories of progress and setback across a nation still grappling with its past. As your mind drifts toward deeper rest, we continue exploring how the legacy of bondage shaped the 20th century and beyond. The scientific revolution of the early 1900s carried within it the distorted racial theories that had been crafted to justify human enslavement. Universities and research institutions, many built with wealth generated by slave labor, became centers for developing pseudoscientific theories about racial difference. Anthropologists measured skulls and cataloged physical features, seeking to prove hierarchies that had been invented to rationalize exploitation. The eugenics movement emerged from this toxic blend of bad science and inherited prejudice, Forced sterilization programs targeted African American women, along with others deemed unfit to reproduce. Immigration laws restricted the entry of people from regions whose inhabitants were considered racially inferior. These policies represented the continuation of thinking patterns that had originated in the need to justify treating human beings as property. Yet the same period witnessed remarkable intellectual achievements by scholars of African descent who challenged these racist assumptions through rigorous research and brilliant analysis. W.E.B. Du Bois's sociological studies documented the actual conditions of African American life with unprecedented precision. Carter G. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, establishing February as Negro History Week, which would later expand into Black History Month. These scholars faced enormous obstacles in accessing research materials, publishing their findings, and gaining recognition for their contributions. They worked in underfunded institutions, often teaching heavy course loads while conducting groundbreaking research in their spare time. Their persistence created an alternative intellectual tradition that preserved African American experiences and challenged dominant narratives about race and history. The emergence of jazz as America's first truly original art form represented a cultural revolution that grew directly from the musical traditions preserved in slave communities. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith transformed the work songs, spirituals, and blues of their ancestors into sophisticated compositions that influenced artists worldwide. Jazz became a universal language that transcended racial boundaries while maintaining its roots in African American experience. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s showcased the intellectual and artistic flowering that occurred when African Americans gained sufficient freedom and resources to fully express their creativity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay explored themes of identity and belonging that resonated with people of color worldwide. Visual artists like Aaron Douglas created new forms of expression that celebrated African heritage while addressing contemporary realities. This cultural renaissance faced constant tension between celebrating African American achievement and confronting ongoing oppression. Artists debated whether their work should focus on uplifting portrayals of Black life or honest depictions of the struggles their communities faced. Some sought to prove African American worthiness for equal treatment by demonstrating cultural sophistication, while others insisted that true freedom required the right to be imperfect and human. The Great Depression of the 1930s affected African American communities with particular severity, as they were often the first fired and last hired in economic downturns. New Deal programs that provided relief and employment sometimes excluded African Americans through discriminatory implementation, though other programs created opportunities for African American artists, writers, and researchers to document their communities' experiences. The Federal Writers Project collected thousands of interviews with formerly enslaved people, preserving first-hand accounts of slavery that would have otherwise been lost. These narratives revealed the complexity of enslaved people's experiences, their resistance strategies, their family relationships, and their hopes for freedom. Reading these accounts today provides intimate glimpses into lives that official records rarely captured. World War II created unprecedented opportunities and challenges for African Americans. The defense industry's need for workers opened factory jobs that had previously been closed to Black workers. The Double V campaign called for victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, highlighting the contradiction between fighting for freedom overseas while experiencing discrimination domestically. African American soldiers served with distinction in segregated units, proving their patriotism and capability despite facing prejudice from their own military. The Tuskegee Airmen became legendary for their skill and courage as fighter pilots. The 761st Tank Battalion earned recognition for their battlefield achievements. These military contributions strengthened arguments for civil rights, while demonstrating the absurdity of racial segregation. The post-war economic boom created new opportunities for some African Americans, while leaving others behind. Government programs that helped veterans attend college and purchase homes often excluded African Americans through discriminatory implementation. The suburbs that grew rapidly in the 1950s were largely closed to black families through restrictive covenants and informal agreements among real estate agents. Television emerged as a powerful cultural force that could either reinforce or challenge racial stereotypes. Early programming often perpetuated demeaning portrayals of African Americans, but the medium also created opportunities for black performers to reach national audiences. The visual nature of television made the brutality of segregation more apparent to viewers who witnessed police attacks on peaceful civil rights demonstrators. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-1956 demonstrated the power of organized economic resistance rooted in church networks that traced back to slavery-era religious communities. The boycott's success showed that African Americans could challenge segregation through sustained collective action, providing a model for the broader civil rights movement that would follow. The legal strategy that culminated in the Brown v. Board of Education decision drew on decades of careful litigation designed to chip away at the legal foundations of segregation. African American lawyers like Thurgood Marshall built their cases on evidence that segregated education was inherently unequal, overturning the separate but equal doctrine that had justified discrimination since the end of Reconstruction. The implementation of school desegregation revealed the depth of white resistance to racial equality. In Little Rock, Arkansas, federal troops were required to escort 9 African American students into Central High School. The images of these young people facing angry mobs while maintaining their dignity provided powerful testimony to the courage required to challenge entrenched systems of oppression. The sit-in movement that began in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1960, engaged a new generation of activists who combined the moral authority of nonviolent resistance with strategic planning that maximized economic and political pressure on segregated businesses. College students who participated in these protests faced arrest, expulsion, and violence while maintaining their commitment to peaceful change. The Freedom Rides of 1961 tested the federal government's commitment to enforcing civil rights laws by sending integrated groups of travelers into the Deep South on interstate buses. The violent attacks on these riders, particularly the firebombing of a bus in Anniston, Alabama, generated national attention and forced federal intervention to protect constitutional rights. The March on Washington in 1963 brought together the largest civil rights demonstration in American history, with participants representing labor unions, religious organizations, and civil rights groups united in demanding jobs and freedom. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech articulated a vision of racial reconciliation that resonated with Americans across racial lines, while maintaining pressure for immediate change. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented the legal culmination of the civil rights movement, dismantling the formal structures of segregation that had replaced slavery as mechanisms for controlling African American freedom. These laws fulfilled promises made during Reconstruction a century earlier, though their implementation required ongoing vigilance and enforcement. The assassination of Malcolm X in 1965 removed a powerful voice for Black nationalism and self-determination, while his intellectual evolution from separatism toward human rights provided a bridge between different approaches to achieving racial justice. His emphasis on connecting African American struggles to global movements for decolonization influenced a generation of activists who saw local fights as part of worldwide resistance to oppression. The urban uprisings of the late 1960s reflected frustration with the slow pace of change despite legal victories. The riots in Watts, Detroit, Newark, and other cities revealed economic inequalities that civil rights laws had not addressed. The destruction of Black-owned businesses and neighborhoods during these uprisings highlighted the complex relationship between protest and progress. The Black Panther Party emerged from these urban struggles with a program that combined militant self-defense with community service programs addressing basic needs like food, healthcare, and education. Their free breakfast programs for children became models for government nutrition programs, while their emphasis on Black pride and self-determination influenced cultural movements worldwide. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 marked the end of an era of optimism about racial progress through nonviolent resistance. The riots that followed his death reflected both grief and anger at the killing of America's most prominent advocate for racial reconciliation. King's death symbolized the ongoing violence that enforced racial hierarchy despite legal changes. The emergence of Black studies programs in colleges and universities during the late 1960s created institutional spaces for examining African American experiences from perspectives controlled by scholars of African descent. These programs preserved cultural knowledge, trained new generations of researchers, and challenged Eurocentric assumptions that had dominated higher education since its founding. The development of Afrocentric approaches to education and culture emphasized connections between African Americans and their ancestral continent, countering centuries of messages that portrayed Africa as primitive or inferior. This cultural movement influenced art, literature, fashion, and naming practices while fostering pride in African heritage that had been systematically denigrated. Women's liberation movements of the 1970s created new opportunities and challenges for African American women, who faced discrimination based on both race and gender. Writers like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison explored the specific experiences of Black women, while activists like Shirley Chisholm broke barriers in electoral politics. The concept of intersectionality, developed by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, provided frameworks for understanding how multiple forms of oppression interact. The economic changes of the 1970s and 1980s disproportionately affected African American communities, as manufacturing industries declined, and service sector jobs often required educational credentials that historical discrimination had made difficult to obtain. Unemployment rates in Black communities remained consistently double those of whites, reflecting structural inequalities that persisted despite legal equality. The emergence of hip-hop culture in the 1970s provided new forms of artistic expression that drew on African American oral traditions while addressing contemporary urban realities. Rap music became a powerful medium for social commentary, allowing young people to document their experiences and challenge mainstream narratives about race and poverty. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s devastated many African American communities while generating harsh criminal justice responses that disproportionately affected people of color. The disparity between sentences for crack and powder cocaine reflected racial biases in the legal system, while the war on drugs filled prisons with nonviolent offenders and separated families across generations. The development of DNA testing technology in the 1990s began revealing the scope of wrongful convictions in the criminal justice system, with African Americans representing a disproportionate share of those exonerated by genetic evidence. These cases highlighted persistent racial biases in policing, prosecution, and jury decision-making that echoed the discriminatory legal practices of earlier eras. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet strength of a grandmother teaching her grandchildren about their family history, connecting them to ancestors who had survived slavery and segregation. Picture the determination of a young lawyer working late into the night on cases that would expand opportunities for future generations. Think of the joy on a father's face as he watched his daughter graduate from college, fulfilling dreams that had been deferred for generations. The threads of this vast historical tapestry continue weaving through our contemporary world, creating patterns both beautiful and troubling. The economic disparities, educational gaps, and health differences that characterize modern America reflect centuries of systematic exclusion rather than natural differences between racial groups. Understanding these patterns provides essential context for addressing ongoing inequalities. The cultural contributions that emerged from slave communities and their descendants enriched not only American society, but influenced global culture in ways that continue expanding. Musical forms, artistic traditions, literary voices, and spiritual practices that originated in the crucible of bondage became universal languages that speak to human experiences of suffering, resistance, and hope. Religious traditions that sustained enslaved people through their darkest hours evolved into institutional networks that continue providing resources for social change. The Black church remained a crucial space for preserving cultural memory, developing leadership, and organizing collective action around issues of justice and equality. Our journey through this history reveals how understanding the past illuminates present challenges while providing tools for creating positive change. The courage, creativity, and resilience that enabled survival through centuries of systematic oppression remain available to inspire contemporary efforts to build more just and equitable societies. The story continues unfolding as each generation grapples with this legacy, finding new ways to honor those who came before while creating opportunities for those who will follow. The voices of enslaved ancestors blend with contemporary freedom fighters, reminding us that the work of justice requires both remembering where we came from and imagining where we might go. As sleep embraces you more fully, rest in the knowledge that this difficult history also contains profound lessons about human resilience and the possibility of transformation. The long journey from slave ships to freedom movements demonstrates that seemingly impossible changes can occur when people refuse to accept injustice as permanent and work together across generations to create better futures. The gentle rustle of papers in courtrooms where new precedents were being set, the steady rhythm of keyboards as researchers documented injustices hidden in archives, the collective intake of breath as audiences witnessed testimonies that had never been heard before. As your consciousness settles into deeper layers of rest, we continue tracing how the legacy of bondage shaped the turn of the millennium and beyond. The technological revolution of the 1990s created unprecedented opportunities for documenting and sharing stories that had been marginalized or forgotten entirely. Digital archives began preserving slave narratives, plantation records, and freedom papers that researchers could access from anywhere in the world. Genealogy websites allowed descendants of enslaved people to trace family connections that had been severed by forced separations centuries earlier. These technological tools revealed patterns that had been invisible when information remained scattered across different institutions. Researchers could now map slave ship routes with precision, track the movement of enslaved families across plantations, and identify the corporate descendants of companies that had profited from human bondage. The data painted a clearer picture of how thoroughly the slave economy had penetrated American business and finance. University scholars began using these digital resources to examine their own institutions' connections to slavery with unprecedented detail. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and dozens of other prestigious universities discovered that their earliest buildings had been constructed by enslaved workers, their endowments funded by plantation profits, and their student bodies drawn largely from slaveholding families. These revelations forced uncomfortable conversations about institutional responsibility and contemporary obligations. The Internet also provided platforms for descendants of enslaved people, to share family stories that had been preserved through oral tradition but never formally recorded. Online communities formed around shared histories, connecting people whose ancestors had lived on the same plantations or survived the same slave ships. These digital reunion spaces recreated the kinship networks that slavery had tried to destroy. Corporate America began confronting its own historical connections to human bondage as researchers traced the origins of major companies and financial institutions. Insurance companies that had insured enslaved people as property, banks that had held mortgages on plantations, and shipping companies that had transported human cargo all faced questions about their historical complicity and contemporary responsibilities. Some corporations responded with formal apologies and commitments to address ongoing inequalities, while others sought to minimize their historical connections or argue that past injustices bore no relationship to present operations. These debates revealed fundamental disagreements about corporate responsibility and the ongoing effects of historical wrongs. The reparations movement gained new momentum as digital tools made it easier to trace specific harms and identify particular beneficiaries. Activists argued that the wealth generated by unpaid slave labor remained concentrated in institutions and families that continued benefiting from historical advantages, while the descendants of enslaved people faced ongoing disadvantages rooted in centuries of exclusion. Legal scholars developed sophisticated arguments for reparations based on precedents from other historical injustices, pointing to reparations paid to Japanese Americans interned during World War II and to Holocaust survivors. They argued that slavery and its aftermath represented a far more extensive and systematic violation of human rights that deserved comparable recognition and remedy. The emergence of DNA testing technology created new possibilities for understanding African ancestry and connecting African Americans to specific regions and ethnic groups on the continent. Television programs featuring genetic genealogy became popular, allowing viewers to witness emotional reunions between African Americans and African relatives separated by centuries of forced migration. These genetic discoveries complicated simple narratives about African American identity while providing new sources of pride and connection. Learning that ancestors came from specific kingdoms or ethnic groups gave people concrete ways to connect with African cultures that slavery had tried to erase. Some African Americans traveled to ancestral homelands, creating new forms of cultural exchange and understanding. The development of memorial sites and museums dedicated to preserving slave trade history provided physical spaces for confronting this difficult past. The International African American Museum in Charleston, the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington created immersive experiences that helped visitors understand the human reality behind historical statistics. These institutions faced challenging decisions about how to present traumatic history in ways that honored victims while educating visitors. Interactive exhibits allowed people to experience aspects of the Middle Passage or plantation life, while digital displays provided individual stories that humanized the millions who had suffered through these systems. The global context of slavery remembrance expanded as other nations began acknowledging their own roles in the Atlantic slave trade. The Netherlands, Britain, France, and Portugal all established museums or memorial sites recognizing their participation in human trafficking. UNESCO designated slave trade sites as World Heritage Locations, creating international frameworks for preservation and education. These international acknowledgments created opportunities for transnational conversations about historical responsibility and contemporary cooperation. African nations that had been sources of enslaved people developed new relationships with diaspora communities in the Americas, while European nations that had profited from the trade explored ways to address historical debts to affected regions. The election of Barack Obama as the first African American president in 2008 seemed to represent the ultimate triumph over the legacy of slavery, demonstrating that racial barriers that had once seemed insurmountable could be overcome. His presidency provided powerful symbolism about American progress, while also revealing the persistence of racial tensions that many had hoped were resolved. Obama's careful navigation of racial issues reflected the complex position of being the first black president in a nation still grappling with its slaveholding past. His speeches about race, particularly his address in Philadelphia during the 2008 campaign and his remarks after the Charleston church shooting in 2015, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how historical injustices continued shaping contemporary relationships. The backlash against Obama's presidency revealed how far America still had to travel toward racial reconciliation. Birther conspiracy theories questioned his citizenship and legitimacy, while coded language about taking the country back reflected anxieties about changing demographics and power relationships. The emergence of explicitly white nationalist movements during this period demonstrated that supremacist ideologies rooted in slavery-era thinking remained active forces in American politics. Social media platforms created new opportunities for both advancing and hindering racial understanding. Online communities allowed activists to organize more effectively while providing platforms for sharing stories and perspectives that mainstream media often ignored. The hashtag activism that emerged around cases of police violence created new forms of solidarity and political engagement. Yet these same platforms also enabled the spread of misinformation and hate speech that reinforced racial prejudices. Online anonymity allowed people to express racist views more freely, while algorithm-driven content recommendation systems sometimes created echo chambers that reinforced existing biases rather than promoting understanding across racial lines. The Black Lives Matter movement that emerged in 2013 brought new energy to struggles for racial justice while explicitly connecting contemporary police violence to historical patterns of racial control. The movement's founders drew on decades of feminist and queer organizing traditions while building on the community networks and protest strategies that had sustained earlier civil rights efforts. The viral videos of police encounters that sparked many Black Lives Matter protests served as modern versions of the photographs and television coverage that had galvanized support for the civil rights movement decades earlier. Visual evidence of racial violence forced broader audiences to confront realities that many preferred to ignore or deny. The movement's emphasis on systemic racism, rather than individual prejudice, reflected more sophisticated understanding of how historical patterns of discrimination had become embedded in institutional practices. Rather than focusing solely on changing hearts and minds, activists demanded structural changes in policing, education, housing, and criminal justice systems. The 2020 protests following George Floyd's murder brought unprecedented numbers of people into the streets, including many white Americans who had not previously participated in racial justice activism. The global scope of these demonstrations revealed how American racial dynamics influenced discussions about justice and equality worldwide. Corporate responses to these protests often included commitments to address racial inequality within their own organizations and supply chains. Some companies established diversity and inclusion programs, while others made financial commitments to organizations working for racial justice. Critics questioned whether these responses represented genuine change or superficial efforts to manage public relations challenges. Educational institutions across the country began re-examining their curricula to include more comprehensive treatment of slavery and its aftermath. The 1619 Project, launched by the New York Times, sparked intense debates about how to teach American history and whether the legacy of slavery should be considered central to the American story. These educational debates revealed fundamental disagreements about how to understand American identity and values. Some argued that honestly confronting the history of slavery and racism was essential for fulfilling American ideals of equality and justice. Others contended that emphasizing historical injustices undermined patriotism and national unity. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 exposed racial health disparities that reflected centuries of discriminatory practices in healthcare, housing, and employment. African Americans died from the virus at disproportionate rates, highlighting how historical disadvantages translated into contemporary vulnerabilities during public health emergencies. The economic disruption caused by pandemic lockdowns particularly affected communities of color, who were more likely to work in service industries that could not operate remotely and less likely to have savings that could sustain them through periods of unemployment. These disparities revealed how economic inequalities rooted in historical exclusion continued affecting daily life. Climate change emerged as another issue where historical patterns of environmental injustice intersected with contemporary challenges. Communities of color were more likely to live near polluting industries, in flood-prone areas, or in regions vulnerable to extreme weather events. These environmental vulnerabilities reflected decades of discriminatory zoning and housing policies that concentrated hazards in minority neighborhoods. The growing recognition of environmental racism connected contemporary activism to longer histories of exploitation and resistance. The same communities that had been targeted for industrial pollution had often been sites of plantation agriculture, suggesting continuities in how powerful interests imposed costs on marginalized populations. International migration patterns brought new African and Caribbean populations to the United States, creating more complex relationships within communities of African descent. Recent immigrants often had different perspectives on American racial dynamics while facing their own challenges with discrimination and cultural adaptation. These newer African diaspora communities sometimes experienced tensions with African Americans whose families had endured centuries of slavery and segregation in the United States. Yet they also created opportunities for cultural exchange and solidarity around shared experiences of racism and exclusion. The preservation of African American cultural traditions continued evolving as new generations found ways to honor ancestral practices while adapting to contemporary circumstances. Hip-hop culture spread globally, carrying messages about racial justice and resistance to audiences worldwide. African American religious traditions influenced spiritual movements across racial and national boundaries. Culinary traditions that had originated in slave communities gained new recognition as African American chefs opened acclaimed restaurants and published cookbooks that celebrated the sophistication of foods that had once been dismissed as simple survival cooking. These efforts revealed how enslaved people had created complex flavor profiles and cooking techniques despite severe resource limitations. Literary voices continued exploring the ongoing effects of slavery on American consciousness. Authors like Toni Morrison, Colson Whitehead, and Ta-Nehisi Coates used fiction and nonfiction to examine how historical traumas shaped contemporary experiences. Their work reached broad audiences while providing new vocabularies for discussing racial dynamics. The art world began re-examining collections and exhibition practices that had historically excluded or marginalized African American artists. Museums acquired works by artists whose contributions had been overlooked, while curators developed new approaches to presenting art that acknowledged the social contexts in which it was created. As your breathing slows and consciousness settles into deeper layers of rest, imagine the quiet satisfaction of a student discovering her great-great-grandmother's name in a digitized freedom paper. Picture the emotional power of a family reunion made possible by DNA testing that connected cousins across continents. Think of the determination in an activist's eyes as she organized her community around issues that connected historical injustices to contemporary challenges. The threads of this vast historical tapestry continue weaving through our contemporary world, creating patterns that reveal both how far we have traveled and how far we still need to go. The technological tools that allow us to trace these connections with unprecedented precision also provide opportunities for building new forms of solidarity and understanding across differences that once seemed insurmountable. The cultural traditions that sustained enslaved communities through their darkest hours have evolved into global languages of resistance and hope that inspire movements for justice worldwide. The spiritual practices, musical forms, and survival strategies that emerged from the crucible of bondage continue providing resources for addressing contemporary challenges. The institutional networks that African Americans built during and after slavery remain essential infrastructure for organizing social change and supporting community development. Churches, schools, mutual aid societies, and cultural organizations that trace their origins to the slavery era continue adapting to serve new generations facing different but related challenges. Understanding this history illuminates how seemingly separate contemporary issues actually connect to longer patterns of exploitation and resistance. Environmental justice, educational equity, criminal justice reform, and economic development all intersect with legacies of the Atlantic slave trade in ways that become visible once we learn to trace these historical threads. The ongoing work of justice requires both remembering where we came from and imagining where we might go. The courage and creativity that enabled survival through centuries of systematic oppression remain available to inspire contemporary efforts to build more equitable societies. The voices of ancestors blend with contemporary freedom fighters, reminding us that transformation is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as permanent. Our journey through this history continues revealing how understanding the past provides tools for creating positive change. The long arc from slave ships to freedom movements demonstrates that seemingly impossible transformations can occur when communities work together across generations to challenge systems of oppression and build alternatives based on human dignity and equality. The story is not finished. Each day brings new opportunities to honor those who came before, while creating possibilities for those who will follow. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade lives on not only in the inequalities it created, but also in the traditions of resistance and resilience that it could never fully destroy. As sleep embraces you completely, rest in the knowledge that this difficult history also contains profound lessons about human potential and the possibility of redemption. The journey from bondage to freedom is never completed in a single generation, but each step forward builds on the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before, creating pathways toward justice that future generations can continue walking. The soft sound of keyboards clicking in research libraries as scholars piece together fragments of forgotten stories. The rustle of aged documents being carefully preserved for future generations. The quiet conversations in community centers, where elders share memories that textbooks never recorded. As you settle into the deepest layers of sleep, we continue following the invisible currents that carry this history into our present moment. The digital revolution of the early 21st century transformed how we understand and interact with the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Social media platforms became spaces where descendants of enslaved people could share family stories, connect with distant relatives, and organize around shared concerns. The same technologies that enabled global commerce also created new opportunities for education, remembrance, and activism. Online databases revolutionized genealogical research, allowing millions of people to trace family histories that had been deliberately obscured or accidentally lost. Websites like Ancestry.com and Family Search contained millions of records from plantation ledgers, ship manifests, and freedom papers that researchers could access from anywhere in the world. These digital tools democratized historical research, enabling ordinary people to uncover their own connections to this vast historical narrative. The emotional impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. Imagine a woman in Detroit learning that her great-great-grandmother had been sold away from her children in Virginia in 1847. Picture a man in London discovering that his ancestors had worked on sugar plantations in Jamaica before migrating to England in the 1960s. These personal revelations transformed abstract historical knowledge into intimate family stories that connected individuals to broader patterns of displacement and survival. DNA testing technology added another dimension to these genealogical searches, providing genetic evidence of African origins that slavery had tried to erase. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA could identify specific regions and ethnic groups from which enslaved ancestors had been taken, sometimes connecting African Americans with living relatives on the African continent. Television shows featuring these genetic reunions became popular, allowing viewers to witness the emotional power of connections restored after centuries of separation. Yet these technological advances also revealed the limitations of genetic analysis and the complexity of identity formation. DNA results often showed mixed ancestry that reflected the sexual violence endemic to slavery, forcing descendants to grapple with family histories that included both victims and perpetrators. The genetic markers that identified African origins sometimes pointed to multiple regions, reflecting the reality that the slave trade had dispersed people from various ethnic groups and geographical areas. The emergence of social media activism created new forms of organizing that built on historical traditions of resistance while adapting to contemporary communication technologies. The viral spread of videos showing police violence against African Americans echoed the role that photography and television had played in earlier civil rights movements, providing visual evidence that forced broader audiences to confront uncomfortable realities. Hashtag campaigns like Section Black Lives Matter, Shaktin Say Her Name, and Me Too created digital spaces for sharing experiences and building solidarity across geographical boundaries. These online movements demonstrated how individual stories could aggregate into powerful collective narratives that challenged dominant assumptions about race, gender, and justice in American society. The global reach of social media platforms meant that conversations about racial justice in America influenced similar discussions worldwide. Activists in Brazil, Colombia, and other countries with large populations of African descent drew inspiration from American movements while sharing their own experiences with racism and discrimination. These transnational connections recreated some of the solidarity networks that had sustained resistance during the slavery era. Educational institutions continued grappling with how to teach the history of slavery and its aftermath in ways that honored victims while helping students understand contemporary relevance. The development of online courses and digital exhibitions made high-quality educational resources available to broader audiences, though debates continued about appropriate content and pedagogical approaches. The 1619 Project, launched by the New York Times in 2019, sparked particularly intense discussions about how to frame American history. The project's central argument that slavery was foundational to American development, rather than a contradiction of American ideals, challenged traditional narratives that many found threatening to their understanding of national identity. Critics argued that emphasizing slavery's centrality to American history promoted division and undermined patriotism, while supporters contended that honest reckoning with the past was essential for addressing ongoing inequalities. These debates revealed fundamental disagreements about how historical memory should shape contemporary politics and social relationships. Schools across the country found themselves at the center of these culture wars as parents, politicians, and educators debated what children should learn about slavery, segregation, and civil rights. Some states passed laws restricting how teachers could discuss racism and discrimination, while others mandated more comprehensive coverage of these topics. These educational battles reflected broader tensions about whose stories deserved inclusion in official versions of American history. The preservation of physical sites connected to the slave trade became increasingly important as development pressures threatened to erase remaining evidence of this history. Archaeological investigations of plantation sites, slave quarters, and urban locations where enslaved people had lived and worked revealed details about daily life that written records rarely captured. Excavations at sites like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello uncovered the foundations of slave cabins and artifacts that illuminated the material conditions of bondage. These archaeological discoveries sometimes contradicted romanticized portrayals of plantation life, revealing the harsh realities that enslaved people had endured, even on properties owned by founding fathers who spoke eloquently about liberty and equality. Urban archaeology in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston revealed how thoroughly slavery had penetrated Northern society and how enslaved people had shaped the development of major American cities. The discovery of the African burial ground in Manhattan during construction of a federal building forced recognition that New York had been a major slave-owning city where thousands of enslaved people had lived, worked, and died. Museums and memorial sites dedicated to preserving slave trade history faced complex challenges in presenting traumatic material in ways that educated visitors without exploiting the suffering of victims. Interactive exhibits that allowed visitors to experience aspects of slave ships or plantation life raised questions about the ethics of simulating trauma for educational purposes. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened on the National Mall in 2016, became a powerful symbol of how far America had traveled in acknowledging previously marginalized histories. The museum's location, near the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial, signaled the central importance of African American experiences to the national story. Yet the museum's popularity also revealed ongoing segregation in how Americans understood their history. Many African American visitors expressed emotional connections to seeing their ancestors' experiences honored in a national institution, while some white visitors seemed surprised to learn about aspects of slavery and discrimination that had been absent from their previous education. Corporate America's relationship with slavery history became increasingly scrutinized as activists and researchers traced the origins of major companies and financial institutions. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life discovered records showing they had insured enslaved people as property. Banks like J.P. Morgan Chase found evidence that predecessor institutions had accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. Some corporations responded to these revelations with formal apologies and commitments to address ongoing racial disparities through hiring practices, procurement policies, and charitable giving. Others sought to minimize their historical connections or argued that events from centuries ago bore no relationship to contemporary operations. The development of reparations proposals at local, state, and federal levels reflected growing recognition that the effects of slavery and discrimination continued shaping contemporary inequalities. California established a reparations task force to study potential remedies for historical injustices, while cities like Evanston, Illinois, implemented programs providing financial assistance to African American residents whose families had been harmed by discriminatory policies. These reparations discussions revealed complex questions about how to identify beneficiaries, calculate damages, and design programs that could meaningfully address historical harms. Some proposals focused on direct cash payments to descendants of enslaved people, while others emphasized investments in education, housing, or business development in communities affected by historical discrimination. The global context of reparations included examples from other countries that had addressed historical injustices through various mechanisms. Germany's payments to Holocaust survivors, Canada's settlements with Indigenous peoples, and South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided models for how societies could acknowledge past wrongs while working toward more equitable futures. Climate change emerged as another lens through which to examine the ongoing effects of historical patterns established during the slavery era. Environmental racism that concentrated polluting industries in communities of color reflected longer histories of using these neighborhoods for undesirable activities. The disproportionate impact of extreme weather events on low-income communities of color revealed how historical disadvantages translated into contemporary vulnerabilities. The concept of climate justice connected environmental activism to broader struggles for racial and economic equality, recognizing that the communities least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions often faced the greatest risks from climate change impacts. This analysis revealed how seemingly separate issues actually intersected in ways that required comprehensive approaches to social and environmental problems. International migration patterns continued reshaping African diaspora communities in the United States as new waves of immigrants arrived from Africa and the Caribbean. These newer arrivals sometimes experienced tensions with African Americans whose families had endured centuries of slavery and segregation, though they also created opportunities for cultural exchange and political solidarity. The experiences of recent African immigrants highlighted how slavery's legacy continued affecting perceptions of people of African descent, regardless of their specific family histories. Discrimination in employment, housing, and education affected all Black people in America, though different communities brought varying resources and strategies for addressing these challenges. Cultural preservation efforts took on new urgency as older generations who had maintained direct connections to post-slavery traditions aged and passed away. Community organizations worked to document traditional cooking techniques, musical practices, and storytelling traditions that carried memories of enslaved ancestors' wisdom and creativity. The recognition of Juneteenth as a federal holiday in 2021 represented both progress in acknowledging slavery's history and limitations in addressing its ongoing effects. While the holiday created opportunities for education and reflection about emancipation, critics noted that symbolic gestures needed to be accompanied by substantive policy changes to address contemporary racial inequalities. Food culture provided another arena where the legacy of enslaved people's contributions gained broader recognition. Restaurants featuring traditional African American cuisine opened in major cities, while cookbook authors and food historians documented the sophisticated culinary traditions that had emerged from the creative adaptation required by slavery's constraints. The global influence of African American music continued expanding through hip-hop, R&B, and other genres that carried messages about social justice to audiences worldwide. Artists used their platforms to educate listeners about historical injustices while inspiring contemporary activism around issues ranging from police violence to educational equity. Literature and film continued exploring how slavery's trauma affected subsequent generations through both direct experience and inherited memory. Authors like Colson Whitehead, Yaa Gyasi, and Jesmyn Ward created works that traced connections between historical and contemporary experiences of racism and resistance. The development of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies raised new questions about how historical biases might be embedded in algorithmic systems that increasingly shaped access to employment, credit, housing, and other opportunities. Researchers found that AI systems often reproduced racial disparities present in the data used to train them, potentially perpetuating discrimination in new forms. Criminal justice reform movements gained momentum as activists connected contemporary mass incarceration to longer histories of racial control that stretched back through Jim Crow segregation to slavery itself. The United States incarceration rates, which disproportionately affected African American men, created family separations and community disruptions that echoed patterns established during slavery. The school-to-prison pipeline that funneled young people of color from underfunded schools into juvenile detention facilities revealed how educational inequalities connected to criminal justice disparities. These systemic patterns required understanding how historical disadvantages compounded across generations to create contemporary challenges. Healthcare disparities that affected African American communities reflected centuries of medical racism that had treated Black bodies as subjects for experimentation rather than patients deserving care and respect. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted these inequalities as communities of color experienced higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death from the virus. The distrust of medical institutions that some African Americans expressed during the pandemic reflected memories of historical abuses like the Tuskegee syphilis study and ongoing experiences of discrimination in healthcare settings. Building trust required acknowledging these historical harms while working to address contemporary inequalities in access and treatment. Voting rights remained contested terrain as some states implemented restrictions that disproportionately affected communities of color, while others expanded access through early voting, mail-in ballots, and automatic registration. These contemporary voting battles connected to longer struggles over political participation that had begun during Reconstruction and continued through the Civil Rights Movement. The rise of white nationalist movements during the 2010s and 2020s revealed how ideologies rooted in slavery-era thinking remained active forces in American politics. Groups that explicitly advocated white supremacy drew on historical narratives that portrayed slavery as beneficial and civil rights movements, as threats to natural racial hierarchies. Social media platforms struggled with how to address hate speech and misinformation that promoted racial violence while protecting legitimate political expression. The viral spread of conspiracy theories and racist content demonstrated how digital technologies could amplify historical prejudices as well as progressive movements for change. As your consciousness drifts toward the deepest levels of sleep, imagine the quiet determination of a teacher developing new curricula that honor the full complexity of American history. Picture the careful hands of an archivist preserving documents that might otherwise be lost to time. Think of the hope in a young activist's voice as she connects historical struggles to contemporary campaigns for justice. The threads of this vast historical tapestry continue weaving through our daily lives in ways both visible and hidden. Every institution, every neighborhood, every family carries traces of this history, whether acknowledged or ignored. Understanding these connections provides essential context for addressing contemporary challenges while honoring those who endured and resisted centuries of systematic oppression. The cultural traditions that sustained enslaved communities through their darkest hours have evolved into global languages of resistance and creativity that inspire movements for justice worldwide. The spiritual practices, musical forms, and survival strategies that emerged from the crucible of bondage continue providing resources for building more equitable communities. The institutional networks that African Americans created during and after slavery remain essential infrastructure for organizing social change and supporting community development. Churches, schools, mutual aid societies, and cultural organizations that trace their origins to the slavery era continue adapting to serve new generations facing different but related challenges. This history illuminates how seemingly separate contemporary issues actually connect to longer patterns of exploitation and resistance. Environmental justice, educational equity, criminal justice reform, and economic development all intersect with legacies of the Atlantic slave trade in ways that become visible once we learn to trace these historical threads. The work of justice requires both remembering where we came from and imagining where we might go. The courage and creativity that enabled survival through centuries of systematic oppression remain available to inspire contemporary efforts to build more equitable societies. The voices of ancestors blend with contemporary freedom fighters, reminding us that transformation is possible when communities refuse to accept injustice as permanent. Our journey through this history reveals how understanding the past provides tools for creating positive change. The long arc from slave ships to freedom movements demonstrates that seemingly impossible transformations can occur when people work together across generations to challenge systems of oppression and build alternatives based on human dignity and equality. The story continues unfolding as each generation grapples with this legacy, finding new ways to honor those who came before while creating opportunities for those who will follow. The echoes of slave ships still reverberate through our societies, but so do the songs of resistance, the prayers of hope, and the dreams of freedom that could never be entirely silenced. As sleep embraces you completely, rest in the knowledge that this difficult history also contains profound lessons about human resilience and the possibility of redemption. The journey from bondage to freedom is never completed in a single generation, but each step forward builds on the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before, creating pathways toward justice that future generations can continue walking. The Atlantic slave trade shaped our world in ways both tragic and transformative, leaving legacies that challenge us to build better futures while never forgetting the price of our past. The whispered prayers in languages almost forgotten, carried across generations by grandmothers who remembered what their own grandmothers had told them. The steady rhythm of footsteps on courthouse steps as lawyers carried briefcases full of documents that would reshape legal precedents. The soft glow of computer screens in libraries where students discovered family names in databases that previous generations could never have imagined accessing. As your mind settles into the final depths of peaceful rest, we reach the end of our journey through one of history's most profound and enduring stories. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended in the 19th century, but its echoes continue reverberating through our world today in ways both obvious and subtle, painful and inspiring. In the 21st century, the descendants of those who survived the Middle Passage have risen to positions that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. They serve as presidents and prime ministers, Nobel Prize winners and Supreme Court justices, artists who reshape global culture, and entrepreneurs who build multinational corporations. Yet even these extraordinary achievements cannot fully heal the wounds that centuries of systematic dehumanization inflicted on entire communities. The wealth that slave labor generated continues flowing through the global economy, though often in forms so transformed that its origins remain hidden. The insurance companies that once insured human beings as property now manage pension funds for millions of retirees. The banks that financed slave ships now offer microloans to small businesses. The ports that received human cargo now handle container ships carrying goods produced by workers whose freedoms and dignity are protected by labor laws that earlier generations fought to establish. Modern technology has revealed connections that previous generations could never trace. Blockchain ledgers now track supply chains to ensure products aren't made with forced labor. Satellite imagery monitors remote regions where contemporary slavery might flourish. Artificial intelligence analyzes patterns that help identify human trafficking operations. The same innovative spirit that once designed more efficient slave ships now creates tools for protecting human freedom. The cultural renaissance that began in slave quarters and continued through Harlem has become a global phenomenon. Hip-hop artists from São Paulo to Seoul carry forward traditions of resistance through rhythm and rhyme. Jazz influences musicians from Tokyo to Johannesburg. The literary voices that emerged from the American South inspire writers across 6 continents. The spiritual traditions that sustained hope through the darkest hours now comfort people of all backgrounds, seeking meaning in difficult times. Educational institutions that once excluded African Americans entirely now actively recruit diverse students and faculty. Universities that were built with slave labor have established scholarship programs for descendants of enslaved people. Museums that once ignored African contributions now feature prominent exhibitions celebrating African diaspora cultures. Elementary schools, where segregation was once enforced by law, now implement curricula that teach children about the full complexity of human history. The legal frameworks that once treated human beings as property have evolved into international human rights standards that, while imperfectly enforced, establish clear principles about human dignity and freedom. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, proclaimed that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court specifically defines enslavement as a crime against humanity. Medical institutions that once used enslaved people as unwilling research subjects now require informed consent and institutional review boards to protect research participants. The same hospitals where enslaved people once received minimal care now serve diverse communities while grappling with persistent health disparities that reflect centuries of unequal treatment. Financial institutions have developed new approaches to addressing historical wrongs and contemporary inequalities. Community development financial institutions provide capital to underserved neighborhoods. Impact investing directs resources toward projects that generate both financial returns and social benefits. Some banks have established programs specifically designed to increase home ownership and business development in communities that were historically excluded from these opportunities. The environmental movement has begun recognizing how patterns of environmental racism connect to longer histories of exploitation. The same communities that once housed slave quarters often became sites for polluting industries. Climate change disproportionately affects regions where plantation agriculture once flourished. Environmental justice activists work to ensure that communities bearing the greatest environmental burdens have voices in decisions affecting their health and safety. Global migration patterns continue reshaping African diaspora communities as economic opportunities, political conflicts, and climate changes drive new movements of people across borders. These contemporary migrations echo earlier forced movements, while offering new possibilities for cultural exchange and mutual support among communities sharing common heritage. The Internet has created virtual spaces where descendants of enslaved people can connect across geographical boundaries, sharing family histories and organizing around shared concerns. Social media platforms enable rapid mobilization around issues of racial justice while also providing forums for education and cultural expression. Digital archives preserve testimonies and documents that might otherwise be lost, ensuring that future generations can access this history directly. Artistic expression continues evolving as new generations find ways to honor ancestral experiences while addressing contemporary challenges. Musicians blend traditional forms with innovative technologies. Visual artists create installations that help viewers understand historical traumas while imagining different futures. Writers explore how inherited trauma affects families across generations, while celebrating resilience and creativity that survive despite systematic oppression. Religious and spiritual traditions that sustained enslaved communities through their darkest hours continue providing resources for addressing contemporary challenges. Liberation theology connects biblical themes of freedom with social justice activism. Indigenous African spiritual practices, preserved through syncretism with Christianity, now influence healing and wellness movements. Meditation and mindfulness practices draw on wisdom traditions from multiple cultures while addressing modern stresses and traumas. The ongoing struggle for racial justice demonstrates how the fundamental issues raised by slavery remain unresolved. Police violence against unarmed African Americans connects to longer patterns of racial control. Educational inequalities reflect centuries of exclusion from quality schooling. Health disparities reveal how historical disadvantages compound across generations. Criminal justice disparities echo legal systems that once treated African Americans as inherently suspect. Yet each generation also brings new tools, new perspectives, and new possibilities for progress. Young activists combine lessons learned from earlier movements with innovative organizing strategies adapted to contemporary conditions. Scholars continue uncovering hidden histories while developing new frameworks for understanding how the past shapes the present. Artists create works that help audiences process difficult truths while imagining better futures. The reparations movement has gained momentum as communities and institutions grapple with how to address historical harms that continue affecting contemporary life. Some cities have established reparations programs. Some universities have created scholarship funds for descendants of enslaved people. Some corporations have committed resources to address racial wealth gaps. These efforts represent initial attempts to reckon with debts that have been accumulating interest for centuries. International efforts to combat contemporary slavery now coordinate across borders to address human trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of modern bondage that affect an estimated 40 million people worldwide. The same moral arguments that ultimately defeated the Atlantic slave trade now motivate campaigns against contemporary forms of human exploitation. As your breathing becomes deeper and more regular, as your muscles relax completely and your thoughts settle into peaceful quiet, consider how this vast historical narrative connects to your own life and the world you inhabit. The institutions you interact with daily, the communities you live in, the culture you consume and create, all carry traces of this history. Understanding the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath is not simply an academic exercise in studying the past. It provides essential context for comprehending contemporary inequalities, cultural traditions, economic patterns, and social relationships. This knowledge equips us to make more informed decisions about how to address ongoing challenges while honoring those who endured unimaginable hardships with extraordinary courage. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is ultimately a story about human resilience, creativity, and the refusal to surrender dignity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. It reveals both the worst and best aspects of human nature. The capacity for cruelty and greed that enabled centuries of systematic exploitation, but also the capacity for resistance, solidarity, and hope that enabled survival and ultimately triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The voices of those who survived the Middle Passage, who built communities in bondage, who preserved cultures across forced migrations, who resisted oppression through countless acts of defiance, large and small, continue speaking to us across the centuries. Their experiences teach us about the importance of community, the power of faith, the necessity of resistance against injustice, and the possibility of maintaining humanity under inhuman conditions. Their descendants who fought for freedom during the Civil War, who built institutions during Reconstruction, who survived the terrorism of the Jim Crow era, who organized during the Civil Rights Movement, who continue working for justice today, carry forward traditions of struggle and hope that inspire people worldwide. As you drift into the deepest, most restorative sleep, let this history settle into your consciousness, not as a burden of guilt or shame, but as a source of wisdom and inspiration for building more just and compassionate communities. The long arc of this story bends toward justice, but only through the continued efforts of people who refuse to accept inequality as natural or permanent. The Atlantic slave trade ended over a century ago, but its legacy lives on in both the challenges we face and the resources we have for addressing them. The same human capacity for resilience that enabled survival through centuries of bondage remains available for creating positive change in our contemporary world. The traditions of resistance, community building, cultural preservation, and spiritual strength that sustained enslaved people through their darkest hours continue providing guidance for anyone working to make the world more equitable and humane. Sleep peacefully, knowing that this difficult history also contains profound lessons about human potential and the possibility of transformation. The journey from slave ships to freedom movements demonstrates that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged and overcome when people work together across generations with courage, creativity, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. The story continues with each new day, each new generation, each new opportunity to choose justice over convenience, compassion over indifference, truth over comfortable myths. The echoes of the Atlantic slave trade will always be with us, but so will the echoes of resistance, the songs of hope, and the dreams of freedom that no chains could ever fully silence. Rest now in the knowledge that understanding this history connects you to the ongoing human struggle for dignity and equality. The past cannot be changed, but the future remains unwritten, waiting for those who will carry forward the best lessons from our shared human story, while working to ensure that such systematic dehumanization never happens again. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the freedom that so many fought to achieve, and renewed commitment to extending that freedom to all who still struggle for dignity and justice in our contemporary world.